Across the heart of Europe in the spring of 1525, the world turned upside down. The established order that had governed medieval society for centuries, an order in which peasants toiled in the mud while nobles lived in splendor, where serfs were bound to the land like livestock, where the rich grew richer and the poor grew hungrier. This ancient hierarchy was about to face its greatest challenge. 60,000 peasants, farmers, blacksmiths, and laborers, men who had spent their entire lives bent over plows and forges, rose up against one of the greatest powers in human history, the Holy Roman Empire itself. What followed wasn't just a rebellion, it was a revolution that shook the foundations of European feudalism. It was a moment when the voiceless found their voice, when the powerless discovered their power, when those who had been told they were nothing proved they were everything. And in one shocking, incredible, almost unbelievable battle, those so-called nobodies, those peasants armed with nothing but farm tools and righteous fury, destroyed the empire's elite knights, warriors who had been trained since childhood in the art of war, men clad in the finest armor, mounted on the strongest war horses, backed by the wealth and authority of princes and kings. This is the story of the German Peasants War, a conflict that has been largely forgotten by history but deserves to be remembered as one of the most remarkable uprisings in human civilization. This is the story of ordinary people who dared to dream of freedom, who dared to challenge the powers that oppressed them, who dared to stand up and say, "No more." This is the story of how faith, fury, and desperation combined to create an army that, for a brief shining moment, made the mighty Holy Roman Empire tremble. If you're enjoying this already, smash like, subscribe, and most importantly, give this video a hype, and I want to know. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country down in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. To understand how 60,000 peasants came to challenge an empire, we must first understand the world they lived in. A world of crushing inequality, brutal exploitation, and systematic oppression that had existed for so long that most people believed it was ordained by God himself. The Holy Roman Empire in the early 16th century was not really an empire in the modern sense. It was a vast, chaotic patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, bishoprics, and free cities stretching across Central Europe, from the North Sea to the Alps, from France to Poland. The empire was ruled, in theory, by an elected emperor, but in practice, power belonged to hundreds of princes, nobles, and church officials who governed their territories with near absolute authority. These rulers owed nominal allegiance to the emperor, but they made their own laws, collected their own taxes, and waged their own wars. The empire was less a unified state than a feudal jigsaw puzzle held together by tradition, religion, and military force. At the bottom of this hierarchical pyramid were the peasants, the vast majority of the empire's population. These were the people who worked the land, who produced the food that fed everyone from beggars to bishops, who generated the wealth that supported the entire feudal system. And yet they owned almost nothing. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission. They were not quite slaves, but they were not free men either. They existed in a legal twilight zone where they had obligations but few rights, where they could be bought and sold along with the land they tilled. The life of a medieval peasant was one of unrelenting hardship and poverty. They lived in crude huts with dirt floors and thatched roofs that leaked when it rained. Their diet consisted primarily of black bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow in their small gardens. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days and special occasions. Many peasants went to bed hungry every night of their lives. Disease was rampant, infant mortality was horrific, life expectancy was short. Most peasants never traveled more than a few miles from the village where they were born. They lived and died in the same mud, working the same fields, generation after generation, bound by chains of tradition and law. But it was not just poverty that oppressed them. It was the system of taxes, fees, and obligations that crushed them under its weight. Peasants owed labor to their lords, days, sometimes weeks, when they had to work on the lord's land instead of their own. They owed a portion of their harvest to the lord. They owed taxes to support the local church. They owed fees for using the lord's mill to grind their grain, the lord's oven to bake their bread, the lord's wine press to make their wine. They needed permission and had to pay fees to marry, to inherit property, to move to another village. If they hunted in the forest or fished in the stream, they were poaching on the lord's property and could be whipped or hanged. The nobility and the church justified this system through religion and tradition. They taught that society was divided into three orders: those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobility; and those who work, the peasants. Each had their God-given role, and to question this arrangement was to question God's plan for the world. The peasants were told that their suffering in this life would be rewarded in heaven, that their poverty was spiritually noble, that obedience to their masters was obedience to God. The priests preached submission, the nobles enforced it with violence. And for centuries, most peasants accepted their lot, because what choice did they have? But in the early 16th century, something changed. A crack appeared in the ideological foundation that supported feudalism, and that crack was caused by a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, challenging the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences and questioning the authority of the Pope. Luther didn't intend to start a revolution. He wanted to reform the Church, to return it to what he believed were the true teachings of Christianity. But his ideas spread like wildfire, carried by the new technology of the printing press. Luther's core message was radical. Salvation came through faith alone, not through the Church's sacraments or the priest's authority. Every Christian could read and interpret the Bible for themselves. They didn't need an intermediary between themselves and God. If this was true for religion, many peasants began to wonder, why not for politics? If popes and bishops could be questioned, why not princes and nobles? If the Bible taught that all men were equal before God, why should some live in castles while others starved in hovels? Luther himself did not advocate social revolution. In fact, he would later denounce the peasants' uprising in the harshest possible terms. But he had unleashed ideas he could not control. Throughout Germany, preachers more radical than Luther began to spread a message of social equality and divine justice. The most famous of these was Thomas Müntzer, a fiery orator who preached that God demanded not just spiritual reform, but social revolution, that the kingdom of God on earth required the overthrow of the ungodly rich and the elevation of the poor. By 1524, the mood in the German countryside had reached a boiling point. Bad harvests had led to hunger. Nobles were increasing taxes and tightening restrictions on peasant freedoms. The contrast between the Church's teachings about Christian charity and the reality of ecclesiastical wealth and corruption was impossible to ignore. Across villages and towns, peasants began to gather in secret meetings, sharing their grievances, discussing their options, whispering the dangerous word, rebellion. The spark that ignited the powder keg came from multiple places almost simultaneously. In the Black Forest region, peasants refused to work on their lord's land during harvest season. In Swabia, serfs gathered to protest new restrictions on their access to common lands. In Franconia, entire villages banded together to resist tax collectors. What started as scattered, local protest quickly spread and merged into something much larger and more dangerous, a coordinated uprising that would engulf much of southern and central Germany. The peasants were not mindless rabble. They were organized, determined, and surprisingly sophisticated in their demands. In March 1525, representatives from various peasant bands met and compiled a document called the 12 Articles, one of the most remarkable political manifestos of the early modern period. This document laid out the peasants' demands in clear, reasonable terms, grounded in both Christian theology and practical grievances. The 12 Articles demanded the right for communities to choose their own pastors. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, which they argued was contrary to Christian teaching that Christ's sacrifice had freed all men. They demanded fair rents and taxes, the restoration of access to forests and streams for hunting and fishing, the end of excessive labor obligations, and the right to fair legal treatment. These were not unreasonable demands. They were asking not for the overthrow of all authority, but for justice, for mercy, for the recognition of their basic human dignity. But to the nobles and princes of the Holy Roman Empire, these demands were revolutionary and terrifying. If peasants could refuse serfdom, if they could choose their own priests, if they could hunt in the forests and fish in the streams, then what was left of noble privilege? What was left of the social order? The 12 Articles were a direct challenge to the entire feudal system, and the ruling class understood this immediately. There could be no compromise, no negotiation. The rebellion had to be crushed, and crushed with maximum brutality to ensure it never happened again. As the spring of 1525 arrived, battle lines were being drawn across Germany. On one side, the might of the Holy Roman Empire, professional soldiers, armored knights, experienced commanders, artillery, and the full weight of political and religious authority. On the other side, tens of thousands of peasants armed with farm implements, hunting weapons, and a burning desire for justice. The world was about to witness something it had never seen before, an army of the dispossessed taking on the masters of Europe. What made the German Peasants' War remarkable was not just that peasants rebelled. Peasant uprisings had occurred before throughout medieval history. What made it remarkable was the scale, organization, and initial success of the rebellion. By the spring of 1525, the peasant movement had transformed from scattered protests into something that resembled an actual military force, an army that could challenge the empire's professional soldiers on the battlefield. The transformation began in the regions of Swabia and Franconia in southern Germany, where the rebellion was strongest and best organized. Here, thousands of peasants began to gather, drawn by word of mouth, by the ringing of church bells, by the circulation of printed pamphlets and manifestos. They came from villages and farms, from workshops and markets. They were farmers and shepherds, blacksmiths and carpenters, millers and brewers. They were young men seeking adventure and old men seeking justice. Some brought their wives and children. They came with whatever weapons they could find or make, scythes straightened into pikes, flails and cudgels, hunting bows and crossbows, a few old swords and rusty helmets salvaged from previous wars. At first glance, this peasant army seemed like a joke, a mob of untrained, poorly equipped farmers that any professional military force could scatter in minutes. But the peasants had several advantages that their enemies underestimated. First, they had numbers. By April 1525, the various peasant bands across southern Germany numbered between 60,000 and 100,000 men, far outnumbering the forces that the princes and nobles could immediately field against them. Second, they had desperation and motivation. These men were fighting not for wages or conquest, but for their families, their freedom, their very survival. They had everything to gain and nothing left to lose. Third, and perhaps most surprisingly, they had military knowledge and tactical skill that shocked their opponents. Many of the peasant rebels were veterans of previous wars. The Holy Roman Empire had been fighting conflicts for decades against the French, against the Ottomans, against various rebellious princes. Peasants had been conscripted into these armies, had learned military drill and tactics, had seen how battles were fought. Some of the peasant bands included former Landsknechts, professional German mercenary soldiers who had fought across Europe and knew warfare intimately. These veterans became the backbone of the peasant army, training their comrades, organizing units, planning operations. The peasants also adopted and adapted one of the most effective defensive tactics of the period, the Wagenburg, or wagon fortress. This was a technique that had been used successfully by the Hussites in Bohemia a century earlier. The peasants would arrange their wagons in a circle or rectangle, chaining them together to create a mobile fortification. Behind these wagons, armed with pikes, crossbows, and early firearms called arquebuses, the peasants could hold off cavalry charges and create a strong defensive position. The Wagenburg could be set up quickly, could be moved to new locations, and turned the peasants' main form of transportation into a tactical asset. Leadership emerged from within the rebellion, men who combined military skill with charismatic appeal and ideological fervor. The most famous was Thomas Münzer, a radical preacher who had been spreading his revolutionary theology across Thuringia. Münzer was not a military man by training, but he was a brilliant orator who could inspire peasants to believe that their cause was not just politically justified, but divinely ordained. He preached that they were God's chosen instruments, that they were establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth, that they would be victorious because righteousness was on their side. Other leaders included Jeklein Rohrbeck, a former soldier who commanded peasant forces in Neckar Valley, Florian Geyer, a minor nobleman who defected to the peasant cause and led the famous Black Company, an elite peasant unit, and Götz von Berlichingen, a knight whose right hand had been replaced with an iron prosthetic and who briefly served as a military advisor to the peasants, though his loyalty was always questionable. As the peasant army grew, it began to achieve stunning successes that sent shockwaves through the German nobility. Towns and cities opened their gates to the rebels, sometimes out of sympathy, sometimes out of fear. The peasants were not just raiders or bandits. They administered justice, held trials for captured nobles, distributed confiscated wealth to the poor. In some areas, they established temporary governments, attempting to create the just Christian society they had been promised but never received. Monasteries were particular targets. These wealthy religious institutions, which preached poverty while sitting on vast estates and treasure hoards, represented everything the peasants hated about the church. Peasant bands stormed monasteries, seized their wealth, destroyed their records of debts and obligations, sometimes killing monks and abbots who resisted. The violence was real, and it was brutal, but it's important to understand it in context. These were people who had been oppressed, exploited, and humiliated for their entire lives, who had watched their children starve while priests lived in luxury. Their anger was righteous, even if their methods were harsh. The peasant army also captured weapons and artillery from nobles' castles and city arsenals. Each victory made them stronger, better equipped, more confident. By late April 1525, the peasant rebellion controlled large swaths of southern Germany. The Swabian League, the main military alliance of princes in the region, was in disarray, struggling to assemble forces to counter the uprising. For the first time in European history, peasants were not just protesting or rioting, they were waging war and winning. The psychological impact of the rebellion's early success cannot be overstated. For centuries, peasants had been told they were worthless, inferior, incapable of governing themselves or making decisions. Now they were proving those lies wrong. They were organizing armies, planning campaigns, taking cities, defeating noble forces. They were showing that the social order was not ordained by God but maintained by force, and that when peasants organized and fought back, they could win. For a few glorious weeks in the spring of 1525, it seemed as if the impossible might happen. It seemed as if the peasants might actually succeed in overthrowing feudalism, in creating a new society based on equality and justice. The dream of a Christian commonwealth, where all men were brothers and the wealth of the land was shared fairly, seemed within reach. The powerless had become powerful. The voiceless had found their voice, and they were making the masters of Europe listen. The first major military confrontation between the peasant army and the forces of the Holy Roman Empire came in early April 1525, near the town of Leipheim in Bavaria. This battle would prove to be a turning point, not because it ended the rebellion, but because it demonstrated that peasant forces could actually defeat professional soldiers in open combat, a possibility that the nobility had never seriously considered. The Swabian League, a military alliance of princes, cities, and church officials in southern Germany, recognized the existential threat posed by the peasant uprising. If the rebellion was not crushed quickly and decisively, it could spread across the entire empire, inspiring serfs and commoners everywhere to rise up against their masters. The League assembled a military force under various commanders and sent them to suppress the rebellion with maximum force and minimum mercy. One of these forces was led by Count Ludwig von Helfenstein, a nobleman commanding a mixed force of heavily armored cavalry and Landsknecht mercenaries. Helfenstein was confident, perhaps overconfident in his mission. He had spent his entire life training for war. His knights were equipped with the finest armor money could buy, mounted on powerful war horses bred for combat. His Landsknechts were professional soldiers, veterans of numerous campaigns, skilled with pike and sword. They were the military elite of their era. What did they have to fear from a mob of farmers? The peasant force near Leipheim, numbering several thousand strong, had established a strong defensive position using their Wagenburg tactics. They had chosen their ground carefully, fortifying an area with natural advantages and preparing for the coming assault. Unlike the disorganized rabble that Helfenstein expected, these peasants were led by experienced military men who understood defensive warfare. They had positioned their wagon fortress to maximize their advantages and minimize the effectiveness of cavalry. The weather on the day of battle was miserable, cold, wet, with intermittent rain that turned the fields into a quagmire of sticky mud. This would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. Medieval cavalry, the dominant military force of the era, required firm ground to charge effectively. A heavy war horse carrying an armored knight needed solid footing to build up the momentum and shock impact that made cavalry charges so devastating. In mud, horses slowed, stumbled, got bogged down. The cavalry's greatest advantage was nullified. Count Helfenstein, dismissing the peasants as beneath serious military consideration, ordered his cavalry to charge the peasant position. It was a decision born of arrogance and contempt, and it would prove fatal. The armored knights spurred their horses forward, lances lowered, expecting to crash through the peasant lines like they had done countless times against other enemies. But the mud slowed them. Their horses labored through the muck, struggling for footing. The charge that should have been a thunderous onslaught became a slow, exhausted advance. Behind their wagon fortress, the peasants held their fire until the last moment. They had captured cannons from nobles' castles and city arsenals, and they had men among them who knew how to use them. They also had arquebuses, early firearms that were inaccurate but devastating at close range. As the cavalry struggled through the mud, closing to within easy range, the peasants opened fire. The sound must have been tremendous. Cannon booming, arquebuses cracking, men shouting. Smoke filled the air. The cavalry charge disintegrated into chaos. Horses went down, throwing their riders. Knights in full armor found themselves face down in the mud, unable to rise under the weight of their own protection. The Landsknecht infantry, following behind the cavalry, found themselves under fire from multiple directions as peasant crossbowmen and archers, positioned in advantageous locations, rained missiles down on them. What followed was a slaughter, but not the slaughter the nobles had planned. The peasants, emboldened by their successful defense, counterattacked. They surged out from behind their wagon fortress with pikes, halberds, and improvised weapons. The battle became a brutal close-quarters melee fought in the mud and rain. The peasants had numerical superiority, and they used it, overwhelming isolated groups of soldiers, pulling knights from their horses, beating them to death with clubs and hammers. Count Helfenstein and his men, realizing the battle was lost, attempted to retreat and regroup. But retreat is the most dangerous moment in any battle, especially when discipline breaks down. The professional soldiers, who had been so confident hours earlier, now fled in panic. Many were cut down as they ran. Others surrendered, throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. Helfenstein himself was captured, along with other noble officers. They were brought before the peasant leaders, expecting to be ransomed, as was customary in medieval warfare. When nobles were captured, they paid a ransom and were released. It was part of the chivalric code, the rules of civilized warfare among the aristocracy. But the peasants were not interested in chivalry or civilized rules. Those rules had never protected them. Those rules had kept them in bondage for centuries. What happened next shocked all of Europe. The peasants held a quick trial and condemned Helfenstein and his noble officers to death. They were executed, run through with pikes and swords, their bodies left in the mud. It was an act of revolutionary violence, a declaration that the old rules no longer applied, that nobles would no longer be granted special status or mercy. The peasants were not playing by the aristocracy's rules anymore. This was total war, class war, a fight for survival where there would be no quarter given and none expected. News of the Battle of Leipheim spread rapidly across Germany. For the peasants, it was proof that their cause could succeed, that they could defeat the empire's armies in open combat. Peasant bands across the region were energized, their numbers swelling as more and more commoners joined the rebellion. The execution of Count Helfenstein became a symbol of peasant power and determination. In one single battle, the unthinkable had happened. The empire's iron fist was broken by its own people. For the nobility, Leipheim was a wake-up call and a source of terror. If peasants could defeat trained soldiers, if they could kill nobles without consequence, then the entire feudal order was at risk. The execution of Helfenstein was seen not as a legitimate act of war, but as murder, sacrilege, an unforgivable crime against the natural order. The nobles understood that this rebellion could not be allowed to stand. The peasants had to be crushed with such overwhelming brutality that no one would ever dare rebel again. The Battle of Leipheim was the high watermark of the peasant rebellion. It proved that with organization, favorable conditions, and tactical intelligence, commoners could defeat the military elite. But it also guaranteed that the empire's response would be merciless. The nobles would gather their full strength and unleash it without restraint or compassion. The war was no longer about taxation or serfdom. It was about survival, for both sides. In the weeks following the Battle of Leipheim, the German Peasants' War reached its peak. The rebellion, which had begun as scattered local protests, had transformed into a movement that threatened the entire feudal structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Across southern and central Germany, from Swabia to Thuringia, from Franconia to Alsace, peasant armies were on the march, and the established order was in full panic. The psychological impact of the rebellion on the nobility was profound. For centuries, nobles had viewed peasants as little more than livestock, useful for labor, but incapable of organized resistance. The very idea that these mud-stained farmers could pose a serious military threat seemed absurd. Yet now, castle after castle was falling to peasant attacks. Town after town was opening its gates to the rebels, sometimes out of sympathy with their cause, sometimes out of fear of what would happen if they resisted. Monasteries, those wealthy religious institutions that represented the church's temporal power, were particularly vulnerable. The peasants had long memories, and they remembered every humiliation, every excessive tax, every abuse of authority. When peasant bands stormed monasteries, they didn't just loot them, they systematically destroyed the records of debts and obligations that had bound generations of peasants to servitude. They threw open the wine cellars and grain stores, distributing food and drink to the poor. They burned the legal documents that represented their bondage. It was a literal destruction of the old order, an attempt to erase the documentary foundations of feudalism. The spread of the rebellion was rapid and seemingly unstoppable. Communication networks that the peasants had developed for trade and seasonal labor now served to coordinate the uprising. Messengers rode between peasant bands, sharing news of victories, coordinating attacks, spreading revolutionary fervor. The printing press, that revolutionary technology of the era, churned out pamphlets and broadsides supporting the peasant cause. Even in areas where the rebellion had not yet taken root, peasants whispered excitedly about what was happening. The impossible was becoming possible. In some regions, the peasants established temporary governments and attempted to create the just society they envisioned. They held assemblies where all men could speak and vote. They elected their own officials. They divided confiscated property among the poor. They abolished the hated feudal dues and labor obligations. For a few brief weeks, parts of Germany experienced a radical experiment in social equality that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. The rebellion even attracted support from unexpected quarters. Minor nobles who were themselves oppressed by more powerful princes saw the peasants as potential allies. Urban artisans and workers, who faced their own exploitation from guildmasters and city councils, sympathized with the peasant cause. Some Protestant preachers, inspired by Luther's challenge to church authority, supported the rebellion as a fulfillment of Christian principles. The movement was expanding beyond its peasant base. threatening to become a general uprising of the lower classes against the entire aristocratic order. Professional soldiers began to desert from noble armies to join the peasant cause. These deserters brought military expertise, weapons, and insider knowledge of noble military plans. Some entire mercenary companies switched sides, calculating that the peasants might actually win and wanting to be on the winning side. This was perhaps the most frightening development for the princes. If their own soldiers couldn't be trusted, if the military forces they depended on for power might turn against them, then their position was truly desperate. In the cities, the rebellion created complex political situations. Many cities were nominally free, self-governing entities within the empire, but they were ruled by wealthy merchant oligarchies that had more in common with the nobility than with common workers. Urban populations were divided. The wealthy burghers feared the rebellion and wanted it crushed. The artisans and laborers often sympathized with the peasants and sometimes rose up in parallel urban revolts. City councils tried to maintain neutrality, opening their gates to whichever side seemed stronger at any given moment, hoping to survive the conflict intact. The Catholic Church found itself in an impossible position. The rebellion was partly inspired by church corruption and partly by Protestant ideas about social equality. Church officials were targets of peasant violence. Bishops and abbots fled their palaces and monasteries. Yet the church couldn't simply support the nobility's brutal suppression of the rebellion without exposing its hypocrisy. How could an institution that preached Christian charity and brotherly love support the massacre of poor Christians seeking justice? The church's moral authority, already damaged by the Reformation, suffered further in the eyes of common people. For the princes and nobles of the Holy Roman Empire, the situation was terrifying. They faced not just a military threat, but an ideological one. The peasants weren't just fighting for better conditions within the feudal system. They were questioning whether the system should exist at all. If the rebellion succeeded, if feudalism was overthrown, then what would happen to noble privilege, aristocratic power, the entire social hierarchy? The nobles understood that they were fighting not just to suppress a rebellion, but to preserve their entire way of life, but the nobility had advantages that would ultimately prove decisive. They had professional military commanders with years of experience. They had access to the empire's arsenals and treasuries. They had political structures that, despite the chaos, could coordinate a military response. Most importantly, they had time. The peasant armies, for all their initial success, had serious structural weaknesses that would become apparent as the rebellion dragged on. The peasant forces were not a unified army, but a collection of separate bands, each with its own leaders, goals, and strategies. Communication between these bands was poor. Coordination was difficult. Strategic planning was limited. While individual peasant armies could be effective in local areas, they couldn't project power or coordinate large-scale operations. The peasants were also tied to the agricultural calendar. Spring was planting season. Many peasant soldiers were torn between their revolutionary aspirations and their practical need to plant crops for the coming year. An army that goes home to plant wheat is not an army that can win a sustained war. The nobles, meanwhile, were mobilizing. The Swabian League, the main military force in southern Germany, was assembling a proper army under experienced command. Other princes were raising forces. Money was being borrowed to hire mercenaries. Artillery was being moved from arsenals to the field. Experienced soldiers who had fought in Italy, France, and against the Ottomans were being recalled. The empire's military machine, slow to start, was beginning to turn. And when it did, it would fall on the peasant armies with overwhelming and merciless force. Inside the Holy Roman Empire, the princes were gathering their revenge. They had been humiliated, frightened, pushed to the brink. Now they would demonstrate to every peasant, every commoner, every person of low birth what happened when the natural order was challenged. The punishment would be so severe, so brutal, so complete that no one would dare rebel again for generations. The brief moment when the powerless ruled the land was about to end in blood and terror. The counteroffensive began in late April and early May of 1525. The Swabian League, under the command of Georg Truchsess von Waldburg, a skilled and ruthless military commander, assembled a professional army and began systematically hunting down and destroying the peasant bands one by one. Waldburg understood that speed and brutality were essential. The longer the rebellion continued, the more it would spread, the more people would join it. He needed to crush it quickly and make an example so terrible that no one would ever dare rebel again. Waldburg's strategy was straightforward and merciless. He would not meet the peasant armies in set-piece battles where they could use their Wagenburg tactics and numerical superiority. Instead, he would use his mobility and professional soldiers to catch peasant forces in vulnerable positions, destroy them with overwhelming firepower, and offer no quarter. This was not war, as the aristocracy usually practiced it, with chivalry and ransoms and civilized rules. This was extermination. The peasant bands, confident after their early victories and still believing in the justice of their cause, were unprepared for what was coming. They were scattered across southern Germany, celebrating their conquests, administering the territories they controlled, debating the details of their new social order. They didn't understand that the empire's response would be total war, that the nobles would use every resource at their disposal to annihilate them. The first major blow came at Böblingen on May 12, 1525. A large peasant force, numbering several thousand, was caught in an unfavorable position by Waldburg's army. The nobles brought up artillery and began a systematic bombardment of the peasant positions. The peasants, lacking counter-battery fire and professional military leadership, couldn't respond effectively. When they tried to retreat, they were caught by cavalry and cut down. Thousands of peasants died in the battle and the subsequent massacre. The survivors scattered, demoralized, and terrified. Waldburg didn't stop. He moved from one peasant stronghold to the next, destroying each force in turn. When peasant armies tried to negotiate, Waldburg promised safe conduct and then massacred them after they surrendered. When towns harbored rebels, he besieged them and executed the leaders after they fell. When villages had supported the rebellion, he burned them and hanged the village leaders. The campaign was characterized by systematic brutality designed to break not just the peasant armies, but the peasant spirit. The final major battle of the war came at Frankenhausen in Thuringia on May 15, 1525. Here, Thomas Münzer, the radical preacher who had become one of the rebellion's most important leaders, had gathered an army of approximately 8,000 peasants. Münzer was not a military man, and his forces were poorly prepared for what they faced. They positioned themselves on a hillside near the town, believing that God would protect them, that their righteousness would bring them victory. The forces arrayed against them were overwhelming. Waldburg and his allies brought professional troops, experienced commanders, and powerful artillery. They surrounded Münzer's position, cutting off all escape routes. Then they brought up their cannons and began to fire. The psychological effect of artillery on troops who have never experienced it before is devastating. The sound, the smoke, the sight of cannonballs tearing through ranks of men, it breaks morale even before it breaks bodies. Münzer had preached that God would intercede, that divine providence would save them. He told his followers that he would catch the enemy cannonballs in his sleeves, that faith would protect them from harm. But God did not intercede. The cannonballs did not stop. And when the peasants, their faith shattered along with their ranks, broke and ran, the cavalry was waiting. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The professional soldiers cut down fleeing peasants by the hundreds, by the thousands. The killing went on for hours. By the end of the day, approximately 6,000 peasants lay dead on the hillside. Thomas Münzer tried to escape, but was captured. He was tortured to extract confessions and information about other rebel leaders. Then he was publicly executed, beheaded before a crowd as a warning to anyone who might consider rebellion. His head was displayed on a spike as a symbol of what happened to those who challenged the established order. The charismatic preacher who had inspired thousands with his vision of a godly society died in agony and humiliation. Across Germany, the pattern repeated. Peasant armies were hunted down and destroyed. Leaders were captured and executed with theatrical cruelty. Supporters were punished. Villages that had joined the rebellion were burned. The repression was not just military, but economic and legal. Peasants were forced to pay huge indemnities to compensate nobles for their losses. Legal rights that some peasants had possessed were revoked. Conditions for serfs were made even harsher than before the rebellion. The death toll was staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 100,000 and 130,000 people died during the German Peasants' War and its immediate aftermath. The vast majority were peasants. Some died in battle, but many more were executed after surrendering, hunted down while fleeing, or killed in reprisal massacres. Entire villages were wiped out. Families were destroyed. The flower of an entire generation of young peasant men was cut down. The brutality of the repression served a deliberate purpose. The nobles wanted to create such terror, such trauma, that no one would ever dare rebel again. They wanted parents to tell their children horror stories about what happened to the peasants who rose up in 1525. They wanted the memory of the rebellion to serve as a warning for centuries to come. And to a large extent, they succeeded. There would not be another major peasant uprising in Germany for generations. The suppression of the rebellion also had profound religious consequences. Martin Luther, the man whose ideas had inadvertently inspired the uprising, wrote a pamphlet titled "Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants," in which he urged the princes to kill the rebels without mercy. Luther was horrified that his religious reformation had been conflated with social revolution. He believed in spiritual equality before God, but not political or social equality on earth. His denunciation of the peasants cost him much of his popularity among the lower classes and tied the Protestant Reformation more closely to princely power rather than popular liberation. The Catholic Church, despite its own conflicts with the rebels, also supported the brutal suppression. Church officials understood that any challenge to the feudal order was ultimately a challenge to their own power and wealth. The massacre of the peasants was portrayed as necessary to maintain Christian civilization against chaos and anarchy. Both Catholics and Protestants agreed that rebellion against established authority was rebellion against God's plan, and that the peasants had gotten what they deserved. In less than a year, the greatest popular uprising in European history to that point had been crushed. More than 100,000 peasants lay dead. Their dream of freedom was drowned in blood. The towns they had liberated were back under noble control. The monasteries they had sacked were being rebuilt. The legal documents they had burned were being rewritten. The old order had been restored, seemingly stronger than ever. But appearances can be deceiving. The empire never ruled the same again. Something fundamental had changed, even if it wasn't immediately visible. The nobles had won the war, but they had learned fear. They had seen what happened when peasants organized, when they fought back, when they believed they could win. The myth of peasant docility and helplessness had been shattered forever. The nobles also understood that they couldn't push their subjects too far, that excessive exploitation could lead to another explosion of violence. In some regions, conditions for peasants actually improved slightly after the war because lords wanted to avoid provoking another rebellion. The reforms were minor and grudging, but they represented an acknowledgement that peasants were human beings with breaking points, not mindless beasts of burden. The rebellion also accelerated changes that were already transforming European society. The feudal system, already under pressure from economic and political changes, began its slow decline. The rise of centralized monarchies, the growth of commerce, the development of professional armies, all these trends worked against the decentralized aristocratic feudalism that the peasants had challenged. The world the peasants had fought to change would eventually change anyway, though not in the way they had envisioned and not in their lifetimes.